to have today Marco from Promigas and talk about basically green hydrogen. We use green hydrogen as one of the main topics, and every month we talk about it. We invite a speaker around the world who is sharing knowledge, who is sharing basically updates, insights about green hydrogen. So I'll invite Carolina to introduce Marco and the topic.
Okay, Erila, thank you very much. So welcome everyone again. And as Erila was mentioning, this is part of the Energy Transition Network. We are accelerating from the IXL Center and from the Global Innovation Management Institute. So again, Erila, thank you very much for having us from the IXL Center. And thank you, Marco. Very excited for you to be here. So let me just give a brief introduction about Marco. So Marco is the Managing Director for Innovation at Promigas. He's going to talk today about the biomethane and hydrogen as enablers of renewable natural gas. Pretty much, this is a very exciting topic that everyone is pretty much interested around the globe. So Marco is, he has been working for Promigas for quite some time already. He's the director of the company Research and Innovation Center in Energy and Gas. He coordinates from there the innovation effort for Promigas and the 11 subsidiaries in Colombia and Peru. And he also leads the development and execution of Promigas R&D, innovation strategy, and runs pretty much the complete innovation model that promotes these articulated actions with different stakeholders around Latin America, Colombia, Peru, and other countries involved in business development, sustainability, and operational areas. He holds a Master of Science and a doctoral degree, majoring in engineering science from the University of South Florida. And he was graduated in 1995 as a mechanical engineer from the Universidad del Norte in Colombia. So it's great to have you here, Dr. Marco Sanjuan. Thank you again very much for joining us, and the floor is yours now.
Marco, you're on mute.
Thank you, Carolina. And it's I'm really excited, and it's truly an honor to be here with you. And let me start with a brief story, actually. She said I came to Promigas a while ago. Actually, I spent 20 years of my life in academia, teaching, doing research. Energy was something I started doing about 2005, and hydrogen in 2007. And Promigas invited me for the creation of the Research and Development Center in 2016. So we started, of course, putting together an innovation plan, putting together a team, and we defined about, I think, 4 or 5 lines of work. And then we were really fortunate to meet Hitendra and the IXL team in 2018 and learn about the GIMI framework. And learning from them, we realized that a formal definition of our growth platforms was missing. So we were exploring innovation in different avenues, allocating resources in different directions. And we worked with them, I think it was about a year or a year and a half, putting together an innovation system. And once we finished, we started working in the company and with some outside consultants also in identifying what would be those growth platforms. By 2019, we launched our renewed innovation strategy, this time not only with different lines of action, but also with specific and clear growth platforms. And what I'm going to present to you today, it's part of the discussions and probably opportunities and challenges that have come out of working in 2 items, two of those molecules, hydrogen and biomethane, coming from those growth platforms that we defined in 2019 and we continue pursuing. So that's part of my excitement and my gratitude to the IXL team for working with us and continue working with us in helping us putting together part of what we're going to show you today. So a little bit, Carol, could you please confirm it's the screen being shared?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to run through a couple of slides to tell you who we are in Promigas. Promigas is a Colombian company, and we have a portfolio of 23 companies, 22 under Promigas, in midstream and downstream natural gas operations, so transmission, distribution, and commercialization in Colombia and Peru. But we also have an electricity distribution company in Colombia, regasification company, LNG regasification operation, the only one in Colombia. And we have businesses, growing businesses in decentralized or distributed energy solutions for industry and commercial applications based on natural gas or solar photovoltaics. We serve 38% of the Colombia's natural gas distribution market and about 94% of the Peruvian distribution market in natural gas. Of course, for any energy company, energy transition is at the core of the discussion of the strategy. So our approach to energy transition is threefold. These are the three main components of our strategy. The first one is to decarbonize our operations. Last year, we launched a roadmap for decarbonization. We call it 2028, 2040. And our target is by 2028, reduce 50% of our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And by 2040, be carbon neutral in Scope 1 and Scope 2. Of course, that leaves Scope 3 out of the question. So how do we decarbonize the product that we're delivering to the market? That's where another pathway comes in. Is to the right, strengthening our low carbon business units that already exist. We have a financing business run through our distribution companies, our DSOs. We offer CHP and CCHP solutions for industries as an energy efficient measures. And our fastest growing sector in low carbon businesses is solar photovoltaic solutions for companies. We started about 5 years ago with a 180 kilowatt project, and we closed last year with 60 megawatts installed in Colombia in solar photovoltaics. And our target for 2040 is to reach 800 megawatts of distributed solar. And this year we'll be launching a new service, energy efficiency as service for industry. But then comes what's next. What's next in addition to solar PV and natural gas, and that's how R&D and innovation can leverage growth and sustainability at the same time. And this is where our innovation strategy comes in, targeting renewable gases, low carbon solutions, customer experience, and what we call digital for sustainability, because we think that adding digital capabilities to any energy service systems that we deploy or energy production system that we deploy, it's going to be key for that time where sustainability metrics are not just going to be part of a report, but actually are going to be a requirement from the market. And they have to be traceable, and we want to be ready for that moment. So that's why the Research and Innovation Center for Energy and Gas was created to support, of course, innovation across the board, but mostly to nurture these growth platforms. And we're working in 2 growth platforms, as I said at the beginning, low carbon solutions and renewable gases. And under renewable gases or low carbon gases, we have hydrogen and biomethane, which are the 2 main topics of discussions today. And of course, also synthetic natural gas, so it's going to be a byproduct of the discussion, and ammonia. And also low carbon technologies that help us deliver low carbon intensity energy solutions for industry, as you see up there. And the color code that you see under this in the title is the maturity level that they have, and the green is the more mature projects that we have. So hydrogen, biomethane, and sustainable mobility projects are the more mature components of our growth platform nowadays. We expect to have, by 2025, at least 1 or 2 commercial solutions deployed in Colombia for those 3. So that's Promigas, that's a Research and Innovation Center, and that's what we've been doing. And although hydrogen is, the topic of discussion all across the world, biomethane, it was probably a few years ago, not so much now, regrettably. I like to start with our growth platforms because in the energy transition, there's not going to be a single solution that solves everyone's problem for every single country. So to provide context for the discussion, you might have seen graphs or pictures like these, right? So if we look at global greenhouse emissions by sector of the economy, the energy sector contributes to 73% of those greenhouse gas emissions, which means that energy transition is a must if we want to decarbonize our livelihood and our economy globally. Now, that 73% figure is a global figure. Just to give you context, in the case of Colombia, the contributions of the energy sector for greenhouse gases is 38%. And you see globally, agriculture, forestry, and land use being 18%. In the case of Colombia, that 18% becomes 55%. So that leads to a different perspective of decarbonization when you look at this at a country level than when you look at this at a global level. Globally, it's a top priority to decarbonize energy. I would say in Colombia, it's a top priority to decarbonize agriculture, forestry, and land use. And part of that is because as part of a developing economy, our energy intensity per capita is very small compared to developed countries. So that's why the contribution of the energy sector is small. Still, we're committed to an energy transition and to delivering new products and services that would decarbonize the energy sector. But the priority level changes depending on the contribution that we have. Now, the second picture that I'll bring to set up the discussion is this is global energy consumption on the left in absolute terms, to the right, a percentage of the pie or share of the global primary energy. And we see two dominant trends. The red line, which is natural gas production, growing over the past 25 years, and actually probably for the next 15 or 20 years, it will continue to grow. And then if you look at the bottom line, which are the low carbon intensity energy sources, hydroelectricity, nuclear energy, and renewables, it's clear the trend for increased renewables. So, I mean, it's clear that there is an increased growth or sustained growth in the production of renewable energy, but also there is a sustained growth in the production of natural gas. And probably, you know, the decline of coal would come first, and then oil, it's already losing a share of the pie, but natural gas is growing. And why is that relevant for the discussion? Because one main difference between electricity and fuels is that when we grow the grid for electricity, that grid will work for any form of electricity generation. So if in a city we're growing the grid at a city scale, or in a country we're growing transmission lines for electricity, those electrons will be the same whether they come from a carbon-run power plant or they come from solar farms or a wind farm. But when we grow infrastructure to serve fuels, that infrastructure will be or will tend to be fuel specific. So if the natural gas demand is growing globally, that means that the pipelines that move natural gas are growing globally. And also liquefaction capacity is growing and regasification capacity is growing. And why is this central to today's discussion? Because I can change generation, operations, or technology in electricity and still be able to use mostly the same transmission lines and grids, and of course, appliances. However, in fuels, if we start switching from the fuels we currently have to other type of fuels that are not compatible with the infrastructure that we have been developing, then there is an additional investment that as a society we will need to make. We will need to invest in a new supply chain, pipelines, tanks, liquefaction units, regasification units suitable for that type of fuel. And this is where developing fuels that are compatible with natural gas or can lead to methane becomes key. Because if we start developing gaseous fuels that are compatible with natural gas, and biomethane is one example, and synthetic natural gas is another example, using hydrogen, then there is no need to reinvest in the already existing transmission and distribution infrastructure. And that's savings for an economy that actually, I think, globally doesn't want to pay a significant surplus for decarbonization. So that's why they become relevant, because they allow us to remain using an infrastructure that is growing. Someone might argue that the infrastructure for refined fuels, gasoline, diesel, petrol, is not growing. But the infrastructure for natural gas is growing globally. So it's a responsible approach to making use and avoid stranded assets that might be invested in probably in this decade and not having use for them in the next decade. So this is why the way how we look at energy transition is that the bar graphs that you see on the left show the global demand for electricity, the blue segment, and the global demand for thermal energy. So globally, we're talking about 20% electricity demand and 80% thermal energy demand. And the reason why this percentage is different is because, as I said, that 20% of electricity demand, if we want to make it more renewable, the green bar is the renewables fraction, which is no more than 23% globally, and 73% or 75% of that electricity comes from fossil fuel globally. If we want to make the green line or the green section larger, that will not affect transmission and distribution infrastructure. And that's the first step. But also, the world is moving into increased electricity consumption. So we're talking about electrifying economy. And that's, of course, a needed step. We need more electricity demand, less thermal demand. The challenge is that not all energy demand can be electrified with technical and economical feasibility. So we have to realize, I think the most optimistic forecast that I saw from the Energy Information Agency from the US is that by 2050, the electricity demand would be about half the energy demand that we have today. So what that means is that the best case scenario, if the global energy demand sustains, electricity demand by 2040, 2050 would be half of that. So that means that we would have been able to solve 50% of our energy requirements coming from, hopefully, more renewable electricity. And that's great. And I said that's a challenge for energy generation. So don't install more fossil fuel plants, install more renewable plants. Same TSO, same DSO operation. However, when we look at the bottom one, the thermal energy demand, at least it's going to be 50% of the total energy demand by 2040. That means that if we want to decarbonize that segment of the economy, we will need an array of renewable fuels. We need low carbon intensity fuels and an intense, of course, decarbonization on those fuel chains. And then you will find studies and report about all those possibilities. So we can have biogas, of course, biomethane, hydrogen, ammonia, bio-SNG, methanol, solar CSP to supply heat at industrial level, biomass, directly burning of biomass. So many opportunities. Ammonia, of course, is one of the ones that's being discussed, not because of the ability to carry hydrogen, but it's also because it's a fuel. And again, it's a change at the production level. But what we have not seen discussed enough is the requirements at the transmission and distribution level, and of course, at the end user level. Just to show you an example, and it's a shame that IAE hasn't still released a Sankey diagram. They have a nice Sankey diagram for global energy production and consumption. This is the one for Colombia. In Colombia, about the supply of primary energy is about 551 terawatt year, and the total consumption is 392 terawatt year. Those energy sources go three pathways. The bottom pathway is all the energy sources that are used to produce electricity, which is the kind of reddish or fuchsia color there. That goes to the demand. Then a large portion of those energy resources go to become refined fuels, diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, and they go to the demand. And another fraction of those energy resources, coal, natural gas, some of the biofuels, go directly to the demand. So those are the three pathways that you will find in any country. What's going to change from country to country, it's what is the fraction of electricity, fuels, refined and non-refined fuels. We have operations in Colombia and Peru, and very similar percentage. 20% of the demand comes from electricity, 80% of the demand comes from fuels. And globally, it's 81 and 21 and 79. So it's very similar. In Colombia's case, for example, those 76 terawatt per year that we demand from electricity are already 70% renewable, mostly hydro. And 18% of the 316 terawatt per year that come from fuels are renewable. That 18% comes from biofuels, ethanol and biodiesel, and wood that is used for burning in low technology operations, mostly in areas away from the main cities. Which means that in our case, the largest gap for energy decarbonization comes from fuels. We have a very small gap, and of course, the government is working with companies in that. But our gap in decarbonization of electricity is very small. If we apply the percentage, 30% of those 76 is no more than 24 terawatt hour per year that need to be decarbonized. But if we look at the gap of energy that needs to be decarbonized in the fuels, that's about 240, 250 terawatt per year. So when we were developing our innovation strategy, that was the key data, the key finding that said, this is where we have our opportunity. A lot of people are working in electricity decarbonization, and there is a small margin for growth there. Little people, very few, were working in 2019 in fuel decarbonization. And that's the largest segment in our economy, and that's the largest gap that we have in decarbonization. So that's why low carbon gases or renewable gases are one of our growth platforms. And when we interact with local companies here in Colombia and they ask about the rationale for our strategy, our advice for them is always make sure that you are not defining action items based on just trends or fashions. There has to be a driver for that. And this was actually, and we keep using this diagram whenever new executives comes into the company to explain why our growth platforms are there. And by the way, why sustainable mobility is there is because 40% of the energy usage in Colombia is in the transport sector. So that's the largest market, and actually is the least decarbonized market because we don't have, as a country, the penetration of electric vehicles that you'll find in some countries in Asia, Europe, or the US. It's still a very small fraction, so it's highly dependent on fuels. So that's a driver, and that was drove us to actually have renewable gases as one of our growth platforms. Now, when we go into renewable gases, and where, of course, there are renewable liquids, you can have drop-in fuels that have low carbon intensity. The reason why they're not part of our innovation strategy is because we haven't developed over 50 years capacities to enter into that liquid market. That would be a significant move away from our infrastructure, our capacities, our network of suppliers. So when you look at that business model map that we work with the IXL team, that was very far away from what we currently had. But working with low carbon gases, that pretty much a match. So we're looking into biomethane, synthetic natural gas, hydrogen and ammonia. And when I say synthetic natural gas, there are two pathways. One pathway is gasify biomass and then have a secondary reaction to produce methane. Or the other pathway is the chemical pathway. Have captured CO2, hydrogen react in a methanation reaction, and there you go. That's what you have, synthetic natural gas. And we consider that synthetic natural gas is the natural pathway for hydrogen to enter into our economy. Because once you make that hydrogen become methane, then again, the infrastructure challenge is solved. So the production pathways that might be different, and of course, I'm trying to describe all of them, but the main or the most dominant ones for biomethane is wet biomass go to anaerobic digestion, either because you have a digester itself or because you have a landfill that it's a natural digester operation, and you get biogas, separate CO2, and then what you get is biomethane. And one advantage of that process is that you have CO2 separation. So if you don't use that CO2, you just emit it, you are running mostly what would be a carbon neutral fuel. If you capture that CO2 and sequester it, then you're running carbon negative fuel. With SNG, you have what we have here is the biological pathway from dry biomass, gasification, methanation with an intake of hydrogen, and then you have methane, and of course the chemical pathway that I just made reference to. And ammonia, you can have air separation of nitrogen, hydrogen coming into a Haber-Bosch reaction and then producing ammonia, one of the many pathways. So a lot of the discussion, again, goes into production. And the common trend of my argument is, what is the impact of them? So if you look at biomethane and bio-SNG from the transmission and distribution infrastructure, mostly no impact whatsoever. Hydrogen, if we want to make use of the natural gas infrastructure for hydrogen, then it becomes a challenge of either blending, and then how much, and is the infrastructure that we have for natural gas ready for hydrogen blending, and to what concentration level? And if it's complete reconversion, then it's how do you take a 20-year-old pipeline that was designed to run on natural gas and make it suitable to run 100% hydrogen. So what we have seen is that if the target is to use the infrastructure as it is, on the distribution side, a little challenge for hydrogen blends up to 20–25%. On the transmission side, where we're using still pipeline, then if it's a new pipeline, what we have found is 15–20% of hydrogen blend would be suitable. But there are not many studies about what a 20 or 30 or 40-year-old pipeline could take, and we're running R&D projects to find that out for our infrastructure. And then ammonia, what we're doing is just scouting the market and seeing when end-use technologies become available commercially, and see how they can play a role. But the challenge with ammonia is that almost is unfeasible to take the natural gas infrastructure and use it to move ammonia. You will require a new, different supply chain for ammonia. Use whatever it exists right now, but if it's to substitute natural gas uses, it's basically a new logistics operation with its own infrastructure that needs to be developed. This is the growth of the biomethane production globally. So the important thing when we have and we're starting projects is that it's a technology that already exists, that is growing mostly in Europe and North America, and there is a small growth in South and Central America. And the reason why we find some, I'm going to go into this later, some countries that do not have, just as Colombia, for example, a biomethane integrated into the economy, is not because of the upgrading stage where you remove the CO2, is because usually lack of incentives in the biogas production. But it's a market that is growing. And if we look at hydrogen, it's also a market that is growing. And not necessarily related to the energy transition. Most of the demand for hydrogen goes for refinery applications, and it's using hydrogen as a reactant to capture sulfur, and in ammonia production. So it's not related to energy transition, the reason why hydrogen has been growing. In Colombia, for example, we have an annual production of about 150,000 tons of hydrogen per year. And most of that hydrogen, I would say 99.5% of that hydrogen, doesn't leave the premise of the place where it's being produced. So it's being produced for self-consumption. The refinery produces hydrogen and uses hydrogen. The fertilizer companies produce hydrogen and they use hydrogen. So you can have hydrogen production in Colombia, like in Colombia, and not have hydrogen distribution and transmission infrastructure because it's self-used. So when we're talking about hydrogen for energy transition, if we want hydrogen to be the end user energy supply, then we're talking about developing a new infrastructure for that. Now, interestingly, when we look at the World Energy Outlook for low carbon gases, in 2019, globally, for energy uses, we have some biogas and biomethane, no low carbon hydrogen as part of the economy. And if we look at the forecast for 2030, in the sustainable development scenario, you will find more biogas and biomethane than hydrogen in that scenario. Now, if we go to the extreme net zero energy by 2050 scenario, by 2030, you will still have more biogas and biomethane than hydrogen in that scenario by 2030. And the reason why it's more actionable is not because of the production technology, because electrolyzers have been around also for years. It's because of the transmission and distribution infrastructure ability to take in that fuel. Now, we have been scouting different countries, mostly in Latin America, and some in North America, in some cases North America, to identify opportunities and barriers for these two, for biomethane and hydrogen. So in the case of biomethane, if we look at the positives, so you'll see in the left, bottom left, the first one is the potential for carbon negative gas. So if you're doing a separation of CO2 because you have to separate the methane stream from the CO2 stream to obtain biomethane. And if you have a high purity level CO2 stream and then capture it, it's an issue of probably compressing, transmission, and going to a sequestration place. And we have a carbon negative application. That's not so easy to achieve on the hydrogen production system. If you're producing hydrogen from steam reforming and you capture CO2, you're breaking even, best case scenario, but you don't have the ability to go carbon negative. It's a natural pathway for decarbonization of natural gas without major change in transmission, distribution, and utilization infrastructure. One good thing, and we saw this when the ethanol and the biodiesel became a requirement in Colombia 20 years ago, you have rural communities, agro-industrial communities becoming energy producers. And it's a very different value chain with more margin for them. So in a time where use of land is challenged and you don't want to use land to produce fuel, the fact that you can use residual waste to produce fuel, as we do in biomethane, gives them a second revenue. We have found in Colombia companies that are installing biodigesters as a measure to treat waste. And then what they do with the biogas that is produced, since they have low energy demand and low thermal demand, they burn it. And the most benefit that they get is that they can claim carbon credits for emitting CO2 instead of emitting directly methane because of the reduction of GHG impact. In this case, they would have a second revenue stream from that biogas if it's transformed into biomethane by a third company. And as I said extensively, the use of the existing gas infrastructure. Now, what challenges have we found? We have found that if there are no incentives to produce biogas, then it's very hard to put together a biomethane business case. Because usually, for example, in Colombia, you could say that average gas prices, natural gas prices, production prices are around $7 per million BTU. So that's a market average. And I would say 99% of that is national production. So we are not sensitive to changes into international market prices. If we invest in anaerobic digestion infrastructure to turn waste residue into biogas, the energy that we get out of the biogas is about $5 to $6 per million BTU. So it's just a $1 margin compared to natural gas. Of course, that business model is not going to be feasible. In the countries where there are incentives or requirements to transform that wet biomass into biogas, then the biomethane business model doesn't have to account for all the investment in the biogas production stage. It can account for a share of that. So we have found that incentives or regulations that require production of biogas are key to actually develop a national biomethane market. We were talking last year to our Ministry of the team of our Ministry of Energy section, and that was central to the discussion. The incentive is not required in the biomethane production stage. It's required in the waste treatment stage to produce biogas. We have also found that one challenge is that if you have a natural gas market, but you have not thought as a country about biomethane, if you take the technology and composition requirements from natural gas and transfer them automatically to biomethane, you're going to make more expensive the biomethane production. So one good example is, for example, oxygen. Oxygen, usually, for example, the requirement from natural gas production is below 0.1%. There is no good reason to have oxygen in fossil natural gas. However, if you're obtaining biomethane from biogas obtained from a landfill, oxygen is a natural occurrence. Because in landfill, when you extract biogas, you will have air coming into the niche of the landfill, and that brings in nitrogen, and that brings in oxygen. If the requirement for biomethane is the same 0.1% that you have for natural gas, fossil natural gas, then additional infrastructure and investment is needed for that production. So being aware of the fact that biomethane will need flexibility in the regulations because of its nature and the centralized production on small scale, it's key. And then that also applies for item 3, transfer conditions. So when someone produces natural gas, usually it's in the scale of 40, 80, 120 million cubic feet per day. Of course, an investment in the transfer station with a lot of sensing, monitoring, online chromatography makes sense. And that investment is about $1 million. That compared to investment in the production well, that's easily diluted in the financial model. However, biomethane projects, the sweet spot is between 0.5 and 0.8 million cubic feet per day. For that type of project to take an investment of $1 million, that's very hard. And then the fourth one is very local in Colombia, tariff restrictions, because we're required, if we are going to enter biomethane into the grid, the maximum price that can be paid for biomethane is the maximum price that is being paid for natural gas. So there is no margin or gap or value given to the decarbonization effort. In hydrogen, of course, very well-known advantages, decarbonization of land-based mobility, gradual decarbonization of natural gas if blending is used. It's a low-carbon fuel precursor, and it's also a well-studied its ability to be used for energy storage in power-to-X applications. Challenges that we have found, still we're talking about colors. And colors are so non-technical and hard to measure and limited. We have, I think, about 12 colors for hydrogen defined by now, and we follow that pathway. In 5 years, we may find a 56 color palette for hydrogen. The world is moving toward carbon intensity and LCI analysis, life cycle analysis for carbon intensity of hydrogen. And that's not uniform across the world. And for example, we have found both in Colombia and Peru that regulations existing or being promoted are still dependent on being green. And green is hard to measure. So they need to have a carbon intensity discussion in many countries and have a carbon intensity threshold for what we call low carbon emission hydrogen is important. Lack of incentives for capital. So for example, in Colombia, there are tax credits or tax incentives for photovoltaic and solar wind and wind projects. And they are enough to have feasible financial projects. The type of incentives that hydrogen needs nowadays, tax incentives are not enough. Capital incentives are required because there is a significant gap if you're using hydrogen for mobility when you compare it to diesel prices or with gasoline prices in our countries. Technical and commercial enabling of blending of hydrogen and natural gas. The reason why we think blending of hydrogen and natural gas makes sense is because it's an easy way to create sustained demand. because there is already in countries like Colombia and Peru a sustained demand for natural gas. And if you're developing a hydrogen mobility project, it's cheaper to go from 100 tons to 110 tons than going from 0 tons to 10 tons. So we believe that blending can enable a sustained demand so that growth from mobility projects, for example, or for drop-in fuel projects can be done with less capital expenditure. And also, we don't see discussion in Latin American countries of plans for hydrogen as a precursor of synthetic natural gas. There is a lot of discussion of how can we make methanol and how can we make drop-in fuels. But we have natural gas infrastructure, and we're thinking of hydrogen as something that we need to take in its current form to the end user. And we think, again, that synthetic natural gas is a natural pathway for that. So I'm going to jump into conclusions. And going back to this picture, growth in natural gas demand means growth in natural gas infrastructure. So decarbonization and emerging fuels need to be thought not only as a production challenge, but also as a distribution or transmission and distribution challenge. An affinity with infrastructure that is not 40 years old, with infrastructure that might be 2 or 3 years old, needs to be part of what we are considering when we are designing these country level or company level strategies. So thank you for your time, and again, open to any discussions, and thank you to Hitendra, Carolina, and the IXL team for the invitation.
Thank you, Marco, very much for the insightful presentation. I'd like to give the floor now to Hitendra Patel, the Managing Director of Global Innovation Management Institute, to moderate this panel of Q&A.
Marco,
We can hear you, HB.
Actually, we can hear you, but you're breaking up. You either have background noise or you need to get close to your mic, HB.
okay, is this better?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Marco, what a great presentation, lots of insights, a wealth of knowledge, and people have questions, people want to know. So there's this huge existing infrastructure to transmission lines and pipelines. And what you're suggesting is it's better to push things through those same transmission lines and pipelines versus trying to do new things around that. The question for many of us here is, this transition is happening. How many of these transitions are subsidized by government or subsidized? And you alluded to that in the last example. And how many are naturally competitive but need an infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And that always takes us to the discussion of whether a carbon tax is a subsidy or not. I think most people would think by now, carbon tax is an internalization of the use that we're making of the atmosphere as a repository of our CO2 emissions. In Colombia, the carbon tax is limited to liquid fuels, for example, and only natural gas being used for petrochemical applications to produce liquid fuels is charged with carbon tax. So the fact that we don't have a carbon tax limits these projects, because the main advantage of moving from fossil fuels to low carbon fuels is the decrease of carbon emissions. So I will take out of the equation the carbon tax, because I think that's something that would be, adopted in many countries. Beyond carbon tax, if we go into actual subsidies, I see the biomethane projects being closer to financial feasibility in natural equilibrium than hydrogen projects, especially because what we've seen in natural gas prices is an increase of them. And for example, in Colombia, although 99% of the natural gas, because the import operates marginally, is internally sourced. 2 years ago, the auctions were closing about $6 per million BTU. Last year, we had auctions closing at $11 per million BTU. And $12 and $13 per million BTU is the natural price for biomethane. So we think that biomethane would be financially feasible as long as the biomethane project doesn't have to pay for the biogas production infrastructure. In the case of hydrogen, it's a different story. I think that the gap in the price of gray hydrogen or natural gas derived hydrogen from steam reformed methane, that should be between $1.5 and $2 per kilogram. And the best prices that you can see today in mid-scale green hydrogen projects is about $5. So there is a significant subsidy that needs to occur. Our argument in that case would be that there is a role to be played by pilot projects, because we have to develop knowledge in projects at scale. It cannot be done at a lab scale. Otherwise, that efficiency might never occur. So someone has to pay for generating volume and demand for technology equipment, and someone has to pay for the team to acquire knowledge.
Marco, in Brazil, for example, they already have moved to a green energy matrix, where a lot of the electricity comes from hydroelectric, and therefore there's no carbon in that. And they also use a lot of methane, methanol from biogas, and the cars are actually able to switch over to, depending on what gas they're using. They're using biogas, methanol to drive this, and they used to be, the graph didn't show that. They used to be one of the world leaders in methanol production with ETH and those companies. Do you have any insight as to what was being subsidized to allow that methanol to be competitive with regular gasoline and other the mix? Because they have been doing it for a long time. And are they subsidizing, or did they find a competitive way to get the price down?
So, you know that the ethanol marketing in Brazil is way older than the one in Colombia. I think it comes from the 70s. In the Colombian case, it was not a subsidy, it was a quota. It was a government requirement. We should have 10% ethanol in all gasoline that is being distributed in cities above 500,000 inhabitants. And we should have, I think we started with 2% biodiesel in the same cities. So there's always the subsidy approach or the quota approach. I think the quota approach has worked well in the 2000s and the 2010s. The challenge is that most countries are dealing with an inflation rate that is higher than they want it to be. And when you apply a quota, that means that you're forcing the market to take in something that is more expensive than what they're already paying. That will have an impact also in inflation rates. So I think that the route of a quota it wouldn't be so popular right now, but it was a way, like for example in Colombia, how the ethanol and biodiesel market got developed. I don't know exactly how it got developed in the Brazilian case, but I think nowadays, if you have a lot of waste residue from agricultural production, and Brazil has a lot, that's why they have, I think in Latin America, probably 9 out of the 10 biomethane projects that are running, because their readiness in waste production, but also I would say, it also depends in the environmental regulations. If environmental regulations are too permissive with residual agricultural waste, then the cheapest way would be to spread all that waste across the fields to use them as, I don't know, fertilizer, low quality fertilizer. If environmental regulations become stringent, then you have to find a way to process that into something that's more manageable. And that's where anaerobic digestion becomes a reasonable pathway for waste treatment.
Very good. Marco, a lot of people are asking about green hydrogen because they're excited about where the world is going, and there's lots of announcements of investments. The Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is a big thing with President Biden saying this is how the US economy is going to transform itself. Europe is pushing hard on this green hydrogen. And the investments, announcements every day, what some sort of $1 billion investment in some obscure region in the world, whether in Botswana or whether it's in Guyana or whether it's in Mexico, whether it's in Arizona somewhere. in the middle of the desert, where there's sunlight or wind. What's your feeling for the pace? It's a pace. How fast is this transition from hydrogen to be competitive with the methane and the methanol and synthetics, but also against coal? Because it's a race. They're all racing towards the end.
I would say that from what we've seen, and this might not sound too popular, I think the growth in hydrogen projects, in most hydrogen projects, is government driven. So show me a country with a large growth in hydrogen projects with no government incentives. And we haven't found one. So it would be great to get examples, because we could use them, because our government is not able to give the incentives that Germany or Saudi Arabia to the NOM project or Spain are doing. So it's a growth that is government driven. That's not bad. I mean, it's good that we are investing in green fuels or low carbon fuels, and that's creating a demand for new technologies, for more fuel cells, for more electrolyzers, different research and development stages for new products, startups. That's great. The thing is, that cannot be sustained for 20 years. So it's important for that to have clear, specific targets. And that would, at the end, has to be, if there is an extra cost compared to what we are paying now for fossil fuels, that extra cost has to be at some point split between the demand, the market, and the government. But most of what we've seen is government subsidizing projects or promoting projects, and then you see the growth for them, and that's the role of the government. The challenge is that at some point the governments will want to transfer that extra cost to the demand, and the demand has to be ready to pay for them. But in Latin American cases, I mean, with the exception of Chile, we haven't seen, for example, in Peru, that willingness to just create a growth of hydrogen projects only based on government incentives.
Good. Very, very, very interesting. In terms of off-takers, the people are using the energy. You showed that a lot of that was being used in transportation. And then there's a whole bunch in industry itself, like cement and glass and other heavy energy usage industries, ammonia production and fertilizers. And a lot of the energy. Are there any new demand generators that you're seeing of new off-takers, because we are creating new industries all the time, new growth, that may have enough profit margins and say they could use green or carbon sequestered energy sources, and therefore, let's say AI people will pay a lot of money for, and therefore the cost of energy might be very little. But when you buy glass or steel, most of the value of glass, steel, or cement is the energy, and therefore the profit is not there. So do you see off-takers who might be more willing to try this new types of sources, even at a higher price, perhaps? Of course, nobody wants to do that, but and therefore pull some of these industries into the market, the sectors.
So what we have seen is, for off-takers that are multinational companies or large national companies that have sustainability goals, they are willing to do partial substitution of their high-intensity hydrogen process, and they start doing partial substitution. When we have discussions with the national governments, what we tell them is that doesn't help the national case for hydrogen. Because, for example, if you take a refinery that they are producing gray hydrogen from natural gas, and they start producing green hydrogen with electrolysis on site, that only has effect within the walls of that refinery. That doesn't change the life of anyone else in the country, other than I can say, oh, and now I'm running a gasoline car with less LCA carbon emissions. So what we need are projects that go outside the own company borders, because if the fertilizer company, the polymer companies, they have a hydrogen demand. Oil processing companies, palm oil processing companies, they also have hydrogen demand, for example, for hydrogenation of palm oil. they will have infrastructure on their side to produce that clean hydrogen. That will have an effect in the statistics, but that will not change the major sector. I mean, transport, the fuel that we're using in furnace, ovens to produce heat, that will not change. So we need those projects because I think that give us inspiration. Oh, they can do that. But also need to plan those projects where the hydrogen will become part, either hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives become part of our daily life.
Marco, I'm going to give you the last minute. We're approaching our time to wrap this meeting up. And we can continue after 10 o'clock if you want to stay on and answer some more questions. But for the purpose of those signing off, we should pay attention to that. Marco, two things. One is, how are you using innovation management to be able to take this ambiguous, uncertain future and aligning your executives, aligning your boards, and then also making people in your organization real? How are you doing this?
I think that we use every single day the principles that we learned from the GIMI Book of Knowledge. I mean, having a strategy, discipline, and capacities clear in our mind. Because it's not only having strategy, discipline, and capacities for innovation management, it's that when you have a growth platform, then you need to have a strategy for that growth platform, discipline in that growth platform. And by the way, in hydrogen, that's hard to do because executives are not always ready for projects that fail. We've been investing in this for 1 year and then it's no financial viability. Well, that requires discipline as well. And then developing capacities. So that framework, it's really, really relevant for us. And I think it becomes natural once you start practicing because it makes sense. You always have to be aware. We're in the process of revisiting our hydrogen strategy. We had a round of 2 years investing in one way and structuring projects in one way that didn't work. No financial viability. Just to give you an idea, we were looking at mobility projects, and the most competitive application of hydrogen in mobility is for heavy trucks and freight. They use diesel fuel, and in Colombia, diesel fuel is subsidized up to 40%. So if in the world it's a challenge to match hydrogen mobility with diesel mobility at international prices, imagine doing that at subsidized prices. So we are replanning our strategy and identifying what new pathways we need to follow, what new capacities we need to develop. So I think the framework has been very helpful across the way since we launched the strategy in 2019.
Marco, that's great. Thank you very much. We have some more questions which we would like to continue the conversation with. But let me just kind of put a wrap around this particular webinar first. Thank you, Global Innovation Management Institute. This is our think tank. We invite world experts on the topics of what are the most important things happening in innovation. Today, we had a speaker, Marco Sanjuan, who was talking about energy transition, carbon sequestering, and something that is touching and affecting everybody. And in there were lots of insights that were shared. Please reach out to him directly for any questions or perhaps adding to your networks. The purpose of the GIMI Think Tank is to connect and collaborate. And through that, we can actually do more together. We also talk about innovation management. I think Mark also talked a little bit about innovation management, about the importance of having a framework or a structure to be able to make it happen across a large number of people and a large organization. Otherwise, how do you have a common language or a common framework? And those are important too. And then ultimately, we learn a little bit about what's going on in innovation around the world. So with that, I want to thank Marco. I'm going to give him the 30 seconds as a soundbite and to say what's your appeal or what's his ask. And with that, I just want to say together, we can. Marco, you have the last word.
Thank you, Tendra. No, I think this requires commitment and requires to have a drive and a clear reason for doing this. I think the worst thing that could happen is having an innovation area in a company doing low carbon fuels or energy transition technologies just because. And that driver has to be connected to your reality, to your context, to your company's strategy. And in the case of Promigas, our infrastructure was continue to grow. So it made sense to develop new fuels that would be able to use that infrastructure. And Go framework. I mean, this requires a structured way of thinking just to be able to sustain it for a long time.
Thank you very much, Marco. Please stay on the line with everybody else who has to drop off. Thank you very much.